There have been, over the course of the Earth's history, 5 major mass extinction events, the most famous of which is probably the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction that wiped out the dinosaurs approximately 65 million years ago. Extinctions continue today, with some scientists categorizing the present as the 6th mass extinction event, the Holocene, or Anthropogene extinction. So in this video, let's take a look at some of these extinct plants and animals, and the products derived from them, that our ancestors ate, but that we, today, probably cannot. In Book 6, Chapter 28 of the Gallic Wars, Julius Caesar describes a rite of passage for many Germani living on the opposite bank of the Rhine River. It is a test of strength and hunting to take down an aurochs. These ancient cattle were gigantic. On average, a bull stood about 180 centimeters at the shoulder and a cow stood at about 155 centimeters, and the horns on males were similarly large, with known examples reaching up to 80 centimeters in length. Caesar described these animals as being not unlike elephants in terms of size, and that's probably an apt description. Estimates put them anywhere between about 680 and about 1950 kilograms. For comparison, a modern bull moose, on average, stands at about 180 centimeters at the shoulder and weighs between 380 to 700 kilograms. The aurochs lived in herds of about 30, and although they did have natural predators like lions and wolves, they probably only came under attack if they were alone or in smaller groups. The size of these animals, and the size of the herds, which granted 30 aurochs is not all that many, but each one weighs around a ton, did not prevent humans from attempting to hunt them, and evidently humans were good at that job. They show up in Paleolithic cave paintings like the famous paintings at Lascaux, and the skulls of aurochs often formed votive offerings or some other form of religious decoration or devotion in ancient temples. Although modern breeds of cattle are often derived from the aurochs, which appears to have been domesticated twice during the Neolithic, and it was found all over Eurasia from France to Turkey to Tibet and China, millennia of hunting, domestication, and eventually deforestation and thus environmental change led to the aurochs going extinct in the 17th century, with the last known animal being dated to Poland in 1627. There are some ideas that maybe it survived a bit longer in Bulgaria, but the evidence for that is not entirely solid. Now, interestingly enough, we may be able to taste this animal again. There have been efforts to breed the aurochs back into existence, notably by the Germans during World War II, and the Heck cattle is another attempt to do so in the modern day. But many cattle of this breed unfortunately died of malnutrition during the winters of 2005 and 2010, after they had been released into the wild, with the aim being that no human would interfere with the creatures to enable natural selection to take place. And unfortunately, the experiment was called off in 2018. The Taurus cattle is the other major attempt to bring the aurochs back, being derived from crossbreeding the Heck cattle and the Sayagusa cattle, but thus far, the results are mixed. Now, if you are happily eating an aurochs steak, it might be nice to pair it with a good wine, which is where the next ancient food comes in. This one is admittedly sort of difficult to talk about in terms of extinct food, and it's actually one that you can play around with and possibly sort of recreate. For the Romans, some of the best Italian wine came from the grapes grown on the slopes of Mount Falernus. Falernian wine was described as a sweet, white wine that was aged in amphora lined with resin, generally made from pine trees, for at least 2 decades. The reason this one is difficult to talk about is that we probably have a descendant of the grapes used to make Falernian wine, but it is not an exact direct descendant, at least food historians and wine experts don't think it is. This is the Aglianico grape, and opinion seems to be mixed. At most, professionals would say that it is probably the same grape used to make Falernian wine. So the exact type of grape may or may not really exist today, but in terms of alcohol levels, this is also where you run into problems, because in modern winemaking, we can control the yeast process in the fermentation, but the Romans could not. They had to rely on naturally occurring yeast, such as in the breakdown of the grapes themselves. So Falernian wine, as a good vintage, is not possible to taste. The vines that produce those particular harvests are long dead, And if we were to recreate it, what we're probably going to be dealing with is knockoff wines, which Roman texts mention as falernian was quite expensive, because it was considered a fine wine. But the amount of falernian sold led some commentators like Galen to note that a lot of it is probably a poorer quality wine sold with the same name. There is, however, another wine you could have paired with that aurochs steak, and this one was considered to be the best wine to be had in the Roman period. When Octavian defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra, the poet Horace tells us that caecuban wine was flowing at victory celebrations. Like falernian wine, caecuban was a smooth white wine, but apparently of better quality than falernian, and it was apparently distinctive in that, as it aged, it turned from a white to an amber, probably not unlike a nice bourbon in color. The grapes for this wine, like falernian, were grown in a specific region of Italy. Today, it is the plain of Fondi, a small region nestled between mountains on the Tyrrhenian Sea. During the Roman era, it was known as the Caecuban Plain. The vineyards that produced this wine were clustered around the city of Amyclae, whose location is today still unknown. Now, unfortunately, we don't know what grapes were used to make caecuban wine, and if Pliny can be believed, that's probably because of Nero. The city must have been located in a somewhat marshy area of the Caecuban Plain, because Pliny tells us that the vineyards next to the city were situated at the base of hills in a marsh next to the city, and this is confirmed by some other sources like Strabo. Octavian apparently really liked this wine, and the vineyard seems to have enjoyed something like a special status under his reign. But when Nero came to power, he apparently wanted to construct a large canal which would run about 160 Roman miles, and in the process, the vineyard that produced caecuban wine was pretty much torn up. The canal project was aborted eventually, but the damage was done. It is possible that there was another vineyard that grew the grapes that produced caecuban wine, but that's not certain. It's just two words in Vitruvius's text on Roman architecture, in which he lists some vineyards, mentions the caecuban vineyard at Amyclae, and then writes, at Terracina. So it's possible that there was a secondary vineyard at this location, but ultimately, it doesn't really seem to have mattered. The last known reference to the wine comes from Galen in the 2nd century, who said that the wine was so dark when he drank it that it was not clear how old it was. It's possible that there were some wine cellars which had leftover caecuban in them up until the time of Galen, but we're really not certain. The textual sources are very scant. With the destruction of the vineyards, the wine seems to have gradually disappeared, and it's not certain what grape was used to make the wine. We do have some proposed candidates, but they've all been heavily questioned. Next up on our list is the passenger pigeon, a species once common across much of the North American continent. Male passenger pigeons were, on average, 390 to 410 millimeters in length, and females on average were 380 to 400. Now at one point it was estimated that there were at least 3 billion of these birds, with some estimates going as high as 5 billion. Passenger pigeons were an abundant and important food supply for both Native Americans and for European colonists. The Seneca, for example, apparently referred to this animal as big bread in their language. The passenger pigeon primarily lived in the forests of eastern North America, but ranged as far as the Great Plains. There are accounts, apparently, of 10,000 of these animals being shot in a few weeks in 1565. And by the 1800s, with the rise of large American cities which needed food, we start getting shipping reports of hundreds of thousands or millions of passenger pigeons being hunted and sent to these cities. The animals were often salted, pickled, or smoked for long-term preservation, or, eventually, once the scale of the trade increased, pigeons were kept in cages or barrels and then killed and prepared as needed. The decline of the passenger pigeon seems to have really kicked off in the middle of the 1800s, when hunters began to notice that there were less birds to shoot, and by the 1870s the population had begun to drastically decline, and the last passenger pigeon that we know of, Martha, died in 1914. And even as they were dying out, small groups of these birds were still pointed out and shot, not only for food, but because American farmers considered them to be pests. Now we come to another food from North America, sometimes called the Holy Grail of apples. Thomas Jefferson is known for a great many things, being a founding father of the United States, writing the Declaration of Independence, being a slave owner, having children with one of his slaves, and apparently growing a type of apple that was incredibly delicious, and then it was never seen again. This is the Taliaferro apple, discovered by Major Richard Taliaferro, who found it growing in a field. He then planted the apples, as did his brother, and then Jefferson began growing them at his home. We do know that he apparently loved the taste of this apple, and each year he would make barrels upon barrels of cider from it, and he described it as being almost like wine. But he doesn't appear to have described the characteristics of this fruit, the shape, the size, etc. So this is the great mystery apple, and since the early 19th century, it seems to have been lost. The official site for Thomas Jefferson's estate puts it succinctly when it says that you can't find something if you don't know what it is. There are 2 or 3 accounts of this apple from the 19th century, but they are contradictory. However, this particular lost food is one that we may very well be able to locate today, because further research has turned up some interesting clues. Susan Walker, who published the major study of the apple, drew on several letters exchanged between 2 congressmen in the early 19th century, one of whom was a relative of Richard Taliaferro, and some orchard records, and from that we may actually have a description of this famous lost food. According to Walker, the Taliaferro apple was similar to the color of straw, medium-sized, and flat, a term here meaning flattened at the poles of what would be the apple's spherical shape. But this is all still not certain. The apple could very well be lost. But then again, there is the Lost Apples Project, which does exactly what you think it does. The people involved hunt for mysterious apples that we know of from textual sources, but which don't seem to be well known today, and it's uncovered many different fruits. So if the Taliaferro apple is still out there, it's possible that we may be able to find it one day, and with luck, you might be able to taste history.